Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm really, truly pleased to be here. I'd only heard about Ithaca, many, many years ago, Cornell University and Ithaca, because it's, really a center of Indonesian studies. And so to be here is such a luxury for me. So thanks for being here. And thanks for inviting me to give this talk. So the title of my talk is about accounts, but it's really, as you will see, it's about how language or understanding of language is actually important to give us some understanding or some insight into how people constitute their relations in public spheres. So what we see as political figures, as politicians, being who they are, actually it's quite, the relationship between politicians as we see them on screen actually is constructed, utterance by utterance, and not just utterance, linguistic things, but also everything or all of the signs, whether it's linguistic sign, meaning words, phrases, sentences, and non-linguistic signs that kind of get bunched together and give us that impression, oh, Trump is like this, Kamala Harris is like this, and they are kind of, when they debate, they are like this, and that's our impression. How do we get there is what I want to talk about here, except we're not talking about the US. We take you right across the continent to Indonesia. So if you see, I'm really stretching the space that is the PowerPoint slides here to give you the real sense of, and you can never be, it can never be a kind of a true representation. It's a representation. It can never be the language as we speak it. But let's see how we go. So first of all, what we're going to see is stuff from what is called broadcast news interviews. The term news interviews was coined by John Heritage and Stephen Clayman from UCLA. They use this term to refer to interviews between a journalist and some public figure. So news really is referring to kind of current affairs. Yeah? So what they talk about is current stuff. So Stephen Clayman says that it's actually, these interviews are a vehicle for relaying news to the public, to the audience. And when we talk about audience, that audience might be co-present in the studio or the audience at home. And Stephen Clayman also says that, the news interviews are also a space where relations among political actors are constituted and displayed for the benefit of the public. And so news interviews are really a type or a particular kind of institutional talk. Now, what we mean by institutional talk is that it has a particular structure, and in the case of news interviews, it has a pre-assigned role. So we know, and you know that when you come in, you either the interviewer, you take on the role of an interviewer or interviewee. Yeah, so there are set roles. And within those roles, the interviewer manages the talk. There is a set amount of time. And so they have to manage everyone's talk within this set of time. And interviewee normatively talk when they are invited, when they are asked, invited to say something. But of course, these are the norms. What transpires in an interview, it's kind of all sorts. And news interviews are, there are so many different varieties, different types or different kinds, if you like. There are hybrid ones. There are talk shows. Indonesian really love so-called talk shows. So that is very different from conversation where, we enter into a chat, really not knowing whether we are speaking or we are actually the addressee, and those roles switch all the time during a particular talk. Very different from conversation. But in fact, some interviews now, at least parts of it would be conversation-like. So recently scholars are kind of moving away from really this position that really dichotomizes between institutional talk and conversation. Now, Stephen Clayman points out that, and I think this is very useful, that the news interviews is different from other types of institutional talk like doctor-patient interaction or 911 calling, in that news interviews really orient to the audience. So you talk for the audience, for the benefit of the audience. And we know that there is, people orient to the audience because these are indicated by things like the interviewer avoid what they call receipt tokens. They avoid giving short responses like, that's right, correct, oh, really, normatively. And the journalist also usually displays understanding for the audience. So they may say something like, so what you're saying is, yeah, so paraphrasing as it were. And then there's also explicit references to the audience. They say things like, many of our viewers are saying such and such, our viewers at home are wondering whether what you're saying is really true, something like that. And then, yeah, the weird thing is in an interview that you don't get in conversation is that at the end of the interview, people are being thanked. And when in thanking, their full names are mentioned, including titles. Yeah. So thank you. This is from Stephen Clayman's example. Terry Bean, Dr. Michael Lang. Now, Abby wouldn't be saying that to me. Thank you, Dr. Noverini. Just it would be really strange if one were to do that in conversation. But in news interviews, that's really the norm. And then it tells us that it's actually not conversation; it's actually institutional talk. So that's a little bit about what has been said about institutional talk, that is the news interview. But I think there's so much more that we can look at when we think about institutional talk, that is the news interview. People, participants in an interview, orient to the public, orient to the audience in so many different ways. And sometimes we see this in the way that everyone except the speaker, whether that speaker is the interviewer, the journalist, or whether that's an interviewee. When somebody says something that is a little bit too speculative or too personal, yeah, something risky that they can be blamed for, how do the others actually respond, right? In conversation, we might say, oh, Maya, you shouldn't say things like that, but you don't get that in an interview, right? So we know that an interview is actually an institutional talk by the way that people respond to such risky talk or, a blameworthy action. And when we talk about action here, we're talking, we're referring to this idea that when people talk, actually they do things. So language is not just words, but actually people do different things, perform different actions through talk. So in Indonesia, Indonesian news interviews, especially those that are less kind of serious in terms of topic, but there's a lot of joking, there's a lot of very informal interaction. Both the interviewer and interviewees, after they say something that's a little bit daring, they might say, "Oops," and we're not going to be captured, are we? Right? And they would be referring to the so-called Undang-Undang Informasi dan Transaksi Elektronik, Undang-Undang UU ITE. That's the Information and Electronics Transaction Law that regulates cases of, delimits what defamation is, and a bunch of other stuff. So people are really fully aware of this, that whether something might happen to them or something, that somebody will say something to them or that they will be taken to court, it varies, the cases varies. But at the beginning, I think it's been revised twice now. The latest revision was as early as this year. But there's a lot of references to this law. So we know that people are actually aware they are speaking in public, and therefore these things are, if you happen to be, the Indonesian term is keceplosan, you say things that you should not say, then maybe we should not have said that. Maybe we should just say, oh, we're not going to be captured, are we? And that kind of makes you feel a little bit safer, supposedly. So again, I'll just repeat here, looking at, of course, there's so much, and Cornell is one of the really strong centers for study on Indonesian politics. Looking at language and the accompanying signs by which we mean words, phrases, and also laughter, silences, gestures, gaze, and signs is useful for understanding what politics is, right? If scholars of political science look at the macro level analysis, we look deep into the more micro stuff, meaning just moment by moment kind of moves where people actually construct the relationships. Okay, so I mentioned that every now and then, actually this happens quite often. Indonesia likes to think itself as a democratic country, and I think it is, and people feel quite free. They feel free to say things in public, politicians or otherwise. But again, what they say, it's very difficult to gauge, and I think in a way, the way that people comment on something that they shouldn't have said gives us an idea of where the boundaries are. Yeah, it's not a hard and fast boundaries. Of course, the undang-undang, the legislation, actually, the law sets the boundaries as if these things are actually very clear. But cases of that's related to the law itself tells us that can be very, very slippery. Somebody was actually taken to court for in the early life of the law. Prita, the cases of Ibu Prita, the friends from Indonesia here will remember, she was taken to court because she had written a letter for a kind of an online community complaining about having to be hospitalized, staying over as an inpatient, saying that that hospital is actually taking advantage of patients who, misdiagnosed her. And she was taken to court because of this law. And that was the beginning of a series of people's, kind of really sense of awareness that this law could do all sorts of things, right? Okay, so then when people are identified as the speaker who said something that they shouldn't have said, inevitably people will exonerate themselves. Well, I only said it because somebody else had said it. So that's exonerating oneself, right? You kind of give some sort of explanation for doing what you've done, for saying what you've done. And so there's a really wonderful, quite an old book written by Charles Antaki, published in 1994, in which he actually devotes the entire chapter on exoneration, so exonerative account. And he defines exonerative account as explanation given when we are in some trouble or faced with some kind of accusation. So it can be, a murder case. So can be a court case. That's a really dramatic case of exoneration people give. Or it could be something that is really just, I said something that wasn't true, and therefore I can explain, right? So it could be very light conversational stuff. And Antaki actually argues that exonerative account is best studied when we look at the organization of talk, sequence by sequence, action by action. What happens? How does exoneration emerge within a talk? How is it that you can all of a sudden you will say, oh no, I didn't know that. That's why I said it. I hadn't been told that I shouldn't have said it. Now, if that piece of talk, you heard it, just that bit, you don't know what came before, then it doesn't make sense to us, right? And so, Antaki looks at the way that somebody gets blamed for something and then exoneration follows. But he insists that should be looked at in terms of sequences of action. And we again, just going back to the idea that when we say something or when we talk, actually, we're performing some kind of social action. So he insists that we should look at that within a single interactional event. So say I'm having a chat with Abby just this morning, just that, and nothing else. You can't look at, multiple events because you will be, the participants of those events will be different and you will be kind of feeling differently. You might not be saying the same thing. So, but that is precisely my question, actually. Can you extend this principle of, sequences to examine exoneration that emerge during multiple interactional events? Can you do that? And if you can, how? So I look at data from Indonesian broadcast interviews, and more specifically, just 3 interviews as the main data. Why these 3? Because these are among, and I'm saying 3 among interviews in which the same mention about 2 figures occur. So it's extraordinary that this, and I hope I will be able to convince you that this animation, by which we mean people kind of voicing some sort of figure, that this is just something that says something very serious about the state of Indonesian politics. So please bear with me. So all the interviews are taken from Total Politik. This is a podcast interview program on Indonesian politics. It's all only on the internet. Actually, it's not available on television. Why Total Politik? Because this is where the whole series of interviews in which this exoneration occurs can be found. So I'll give you the background context of the interview. So the topic that we look at here. So earlier this year in February, there was Indonesia had presidential election that's been and gone, very dramatic, but by and large a smooth process. Although the opposition, so there is no formal opposition in Indonesia, the oppositions would kind of question that. But following that, Indonesia is actually this month, actually next month in November, is going to hold the regional elections across more than 500 seats. Right? So all of a sudden, just after the presidential elections of, that's been and gone in February, and then in August, the leader of Golkar is one of Indonesia's largest political parties. It's actually, if you like, the party founded by people in government. And so it would always follow the direction of the government. But all of a sudden, the leader of Golkar resigned. No explanation. All of a sudden, he resigned, right? Airlangga Hartarto, his name was. And this was at a very crucial time when his party has to nominate candidates to run for over 500 regional seats. So people are wondering, of course, why? Why now? If it's not just why you, but why now? Right? And so there are speculations that Jokowi, the former Indonesian president, was involved in that decision, that he basically, crudely speaking, he told Airlangga to step down and that he would install his own person. We don't know that. Like, how do we actually get to know that? And I'll show you what Jokowi himself said about this animation. Okay, so here in what we will see is that somebody who is a supporter of Jokowi himself said something and actually animated a whole kind of a story, or constructing 2 figures in dialogue with each other to comment on that recent political event. So we would call him the animator, and this is the term from Goffman, Irving Goffman. So Irving Goffman, sociologist, was saying that if we look at talk, it's not enough for us to just be thinking about the categories speaker and hearer. In fact, the role of speaker, they're different. Yeah, so he comes up with further categories of speaker role. And principal is the role of someone that actually kind of has the ideas and beliefs that that's being communicated. Animator is the sounding voice, the person who speaks. And author is the one who comes up with the expressions for it. Yeah. So those who are familiar with Goffman's work would be very familiar with the concept of animator. But for us, let's just think of the animator is the person who gives voice, who animates this figure. And by figure, we mean some abstract, it's not the same. A figure is not the same as a person. Right? The construction of a figure is some sort of abstract entity that may or may not be identified with a real person. In this case, actually, it's pretty clear who these two figures are. But one is mentioned explicitly, the other is never mentioned who it is. All right. So to help me analyze the talk, I turned to a recent paper by Charles Tuckerman, Chip Tuckerman, in which he came up with these two concepts, figure composition and figure transparency. Very quickly, basically, the idea of figure composition is for us to look at aspects or elements of language that are frequently used or resources of language that are being used to construct the figure, right? And then figure transparency is about how salient, how transparent those elements are in the figuration. So for example, we will see that references to the self, like I and you, are really quite transparent in that in the dialogue between the two figures, it's always I and you, I and you. And so we here would say that reference to the self and the addressee by means, in this case, by means of personal pronouns, but in Indonesian, it is a whole suite of things, not just personal pronouns. Pronouns are just one of the kind of category of elements that Indonesian speakers would use. So those are given high transparency in the interviews. And when we understand what they say, in fact, our understanding is not gained from just this one or two pronouns, because those pronouns are used along with other elements of language, right? What we might, kind of in a simpler term, say context. And we actually understand so-called meaning of these pronouns in context as a kind of wholesale, right? It's a bunch of things. So it's the pronouns themselves provide us with a sketch, interactional sketch, and then they get filled with co-occurring signs, whether it's gesture, laughter, and so on, and a lot of laughter in this data, all projected concurrently when they are in use. Right? So when we think about Trump as being somebody, I've been watching the television in the last few days, people say, oh, he's a fascist, and so on. How did we arrive at that? It's not just his mouth, right? That the way that he protrudes his lips, but it's a whole bunch of things. It's a whole bunch of things that then took us to the idea of a fascist. Yeah. Okay, so let's have a look now, taking you straight to the interviews. So there are 3 interviews. So this is interview 1 that forms the basis of our understanding of the later interview. So it's useful to think about this in terms of construal. So what we construe, how we construe this first interview helps us or guides us in interpreting the subsequent interviews, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so here is the main people. There's the Budi and Ari are the interviewers. They are from Total Politik. They describe themselves as co-founders of Total Politik. It's very fancy. So you wouldn't call them journalists, right? Or another term that they might be okay with is content creator, right? And they're very, very smart guys. They laugh a lot. And Kodari Muhammad Qadari, or dubbed Mr. Q, is a kind of a frequent guest to this program. Okay, so here's the culprit, right? Here's the culprit. Now I want to play the video, very, very short. Yeah. So hopefully.
Dia apa? Melawan tukang kayu.
Yeah, let's see if we can give you. Oh. I would like auto translate. Yeah. Okay. So here it's and this is very recent. Actually, the government or whoever the leader is the sun, right? So you follow the sun. You follow the sun. But the leader of Golkar, remember Golkar is supposed to be the government party. The Airlangga Hartarto, he doesn't follow the sun. He chooses to live in darkness, he said. So, and then after he says this, he said, that's the problem. Yeah? You know, he chooses to live in darkness. And then that will be the start of the animation, the animating. He's giving voice, he's constructing two figures. And one is a tree, the other is the woodworker. Now, the term tukang kayu in Indonesian is ambiguous between a tree, tukang kayu as a woodworker and a carpenter, and someone whose livelihood is to look for wood, right? I just translated it as woodworker. I think it's a bit more neutral than carpenter, because carpenter kind of connotes, you know, a lot of skill. So we know, what do we know about Jokowi? Who was he before he became president? Yeah. Exactly. So you will see that at the mention of furniture, everyone just burst into laughter. But let's see here. He just loves, you know, he has this really shrill laugh. So you would love it.
Sebesar-besar pohon. Kalau udah melawan tukang kayu atau rumbang juga. Pohon beringin, pohon jati, bisa gede banget tuh. Alot, tapi kalau udah ketemu tukang kayu, jadi perabot lu. Lu siapa lu dulu? Wah, gua kayu jati, Pak. Gede apa kecil? Gede. Ya, lu kok bisa jadi gini? Ketemu tukang kayu. Di mana gedenya? Lu gak kelihatan. Ya tadi, Pak, ketemu tukang kayu, Pak. Dia punya perkakas.
Gue gak berani gitu. Gue juga bakal lucu sih, tapi gue
itu ya, ingat-ingat ya, segede-gede pohon kalah juga lawan tukang kayu.
Okay. We can watch it again later on. Okay, so now, how do I go back? Is that one?
Yes.
Okay. From current slide. Okay. Okay, so that was the video. Just that bit. So I'll give you a summary. So to analyze this, I divide this into 4 excerpts, right? So in excerpt 1, it sets up the background. You can see that he's already said, okay, there's a tree. If the tree meets the woodworker and doesn't comply with the woodworker, it will fall. And then he just repeats the whole thing again, right? And in fact, that's not the only time he repeated it. It was repeated and repeated and repeated. In fact, there was an interview yesterday that I was listening to last night. He repeated the same thing. Okay, so this has become something really interesting. So in excerpt 1, they figure a tree and the woodworker are introduced. And it lays out the condition to introduce the relationship between the tree and the woodworker. If the tree doesn't comply with the woodworker's wishes, it will fall. Yeah, conditional relationship. And then in excerpt 2, this condition is expanded. You know, they talk about how it doesn't matter. You can be big, you can be tough, but if you don't comply with the woodworkers' wishes, you will be diminished, basically. Yeah. And then in excerpt 3, that is very interesting because they very, very briefly talk about the tree's change of state. How come you've become like this? We don't know what like this is, right? Well, so it's all very non-specific. And Kodari uses the term jadi gini, become like this. How come you become like this? And then in the last excerpt, it's an expansion of that, of excerpt 3. It elaborates on the tree's state of diminished. If in excerpt 3, oh, how come you're like this? In excerpt 4, how come you're no longer visible, like you're done with, right? So it's pretty eerie. Lots of love, but in fact, it's just what he says, very serious. Okay, not to scare you with linguistic data. That's why I put in a lot of pictures and a lot of. Okay, so there's the woodworker and there's the tree, right? The two figures that are being constructed here. So setting the scene, Kodari said, "What is it? What is it?" You know, dia, non-specific in terms of gender in Indonesian. Dia can be a male, it can be a he, it, can be a she, goes against the woodworker. No matter how large a tree is, if it's rotten, Budi jumps in. Yeah. So here is a really nice thing. So Kodari said, no matter how large a tree is, and of course we know that conditional construction, we can jump in. If it goes against the woodworker, or in this case, Budi said, if it's rotten, and then Kodari said, if it goes against the woodworker, so he corrects it, right? Then it will fall. And then Mr. Q, you know, bursts into laughter, and Budi actually laughs nasally. And he partly covers his mouth with his left hand, and Ari, the other guy, the guy in red, he partly covers his mouth with his left hand, turns his gaze towards Budi, and smiles faintly, right? Faintly. It gets better. Okay, so here we are. In terms of language, this is very interesting because you get a grammatical construction being invoked. So people know this grammatical construction, this conditional construction, right? So Kodari says something, Kodari provides the adjunct, yeah, the construction, and then Budi jumps in. So I'm just giving you here the schematic representation of this interaction. So Kodari starts with the adjunct, no matter how large a tree is, and then Budi comes in. If it's already rotten, and then Kodari comes in again. If it goes against the woodworker, then it will fall. So the condition here is collaboratively constructed, which is very nice. Okay, now we're on to excerpt 2, the next bit. Again, it's just expanding that condition, yeah, conditional relationship. Kodari said, are you a banyan tree? Are you? And Budi said, yeah, but it's not an affirmative answer. It's just a receipt of hearing, right? Are you a teak tree? Okay. Whoa, you can get very big, very tough. But if you bump into the woodworker, you'll turn into furniture. At the mention of tukang kayu or prabot, in this case, a real word for furniture, they just burst into laughter again. Everyone was laughing. But look at how Budi, the one on the left, responds to this. He says, you know, an interjection, say, "Waduh, yeah? Oh my God." And he actually starts laughing, not just laughing, he bends his body to the right, facing away from Mr. Q and from Ari, his co-host. And then it's more than this. He's got a mug on his head. He moves the mug from right hand to left hand, and then he straightens his body, faces Mr. Q and again, and then moves his mug to the right, and then goes, tangan dijidat. So the hand covering his face. So that's a pretty elaborate corporeal response, right, to this animating. Why is that? Why is it so elaborate? Yeah. Well, I can just laugh, whatever, I can say that, but the response is very elaborate. So what are the resources for composing this figure that we can see here? There's repetition, right? You see banyan tree, pohon beringin, pohon jati, exactly the same construction. So they draw on this, what Jacobson says about poetic structure. So you select, the different forms and combine them to create this, poetic structure. And poetic structure, poetic language permeates all uses of language that we have. And so repetition is a real resource here. And there's grammatical repetition because it's a rhetorical question, right? So that's a grammatical form that gets repeated. So it's both lexical and grammatical repetition. And then there's an unexpressed subject. So in Indonesian and some other languages such as Korean, Japanese, Mandarin Chinese, you can get away without mentioning the subject overtly or explicitly, right? And so this is a real resource that gets exploited here. So Kodari doesn't say you can get very big, but it's ambiguous because it's not explicitly expressed. It can be ambiguous between it referring to the third party or you can get very big, as in generic you. But then when he said, if you bump, again, there is no you here. That's why I put it in between brackets for English kind of acceptability. If you bump into a woodworker, then you'll turn into furniture. Have a look here. The word lu from Hokkien is actually explicitly used, whereas in the other places, it's all unexpressed. So you'll be turned into furniture. It gives you that heightened sense of that effect, right? The result of the condition. If you don't meet the condition, this is what's going to happen to you. Yeah. So again, the contrast between unexpressed and expressed argument, meaning argument in the sense that either object or subject, becomes a real element in this composition, in this figure composition. Okay, let's move on. So I've already talked about that. Again, there's another one here. There's another resource here, which is really quite nifty. It's so nifty because there is something, is everyone familiar with the so-called free indirect discourse? So free indirect discourse is when you get, people talk about this in fiction, when the analysis of fiction, where it seems to be, something seems to be described from the perspective of the narrator and the character at the same time. So then you get double perspective, right? You get double perspective. And which one is which? Sometimes it's very uncertain. And so it's the same as this. So Kodari really exploits this. Of course, he doesn't talk about free indirect discourse, but you can see here how rich this data is, from talking about you or generic you, or in this case, it's actually ambiguous, to actually pinpoint there's a you here, generic. Yeah. Okay, so exit 3, this is where the addresses, identity and change of state is being talked about. So Mr. Q said, tapping the table, actually, there's another thing that I'm not going to talk about here, but this references to wayang, the traditional puppet, where you've got the practice of dodokan. Dodokan, the dalang goes, dok, 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 yeah, kind of before the commencement of an entrance. So that gets really exploited here. So Kodari said, so he started with Lu generic, right? Generic. And then in this, and this is the continuation, it's the same kind of speech. He said, Lu siapa lu dulu? So you, who were you before? Who were you before, right? Very explicitly. And then it's the same animator. Kodari said, wa, again, explicit, wa, I, right? The Hokkien borrowing wa kayu jati, Pak. I am teak tree. I am a teak tree. And then he puts the address term Pak. So we know that this unnamed figure who's talking to the tree is actually a male entity, right? Because there's the term Papa from father, and that's being used as an address term. So you can see that the pronouns lu and gua explicitly expressed here, explicit expression of self and addressee and being contrasted. So you, who were you before? Oh, I am a teak tree. Right? So in fact, this is the environment in which speakers of Indonesian often use explicit reference, where they contrast things, yeah? Or when they claim something. I know what you think. That's when I would say I quite explicitly. Okay, so the next bit, he goes back to no unexpressed subject. You know, large or small? And are you large or small? Or large? Yeah, I am large. But there's no reference that is explicit. And then he goes on to say, lu kok bisa jadi gini? Lu kok bisa jadi gini? How come you've become like this? Right? And then the tree said, I met the woodworker. There's no I here. Yeah. So you get the explicit subject and then the unexpressed subject. It's very similar in pattern to a study by Barbara Fox published in 1987, where she actually looked at English conversation. So people might start with kind of a longer expression, such as the name or a descriptive term, and then it can be referred back with a shorter term. So this is not exactly the same, but here there's an explicit subject, lu or gua, and then following that, you can just assume that it's the same entity that gets referred to. And then how does Budi? Yeah, remember Budi has responded with this very elaborate corporeal kind of response. He ups that by swearing, actually mild swearing. He said anjing, yeah, literally means dog. Yeah, actually I couldn't hear properly whether he said anjing or anjir. Anjir is just a plesetan, yeah, just kind of soften the term anjing. And then he doesn't. Anjing. Oh. Anjing, yeah. And he doesn't just swear, he actually laughs and then he pulls the front of his shirt such that it covers like 3/4 of his face as he says anjing, right? Whereas before he turned away, now he actually still laughing, but he says pulling that. Okay, so this is what I have said before about explicit reference or unexplicit reference. So I'm going to just skip that. Excerpt 4. Here is something that is fairly delicate, but when you look at it, in fact, this is just astonishing again. You know, lu, the pronoun from Hokkien, previously we saw, and this was quite audible. The difference is quite audible. Yeah, lu. In this bit here, there's a lu. So there's an added segment, yeah, in front. So we call it, in linguistics, is termed segmental. So the difference between lu and alu is actually informationally significant. If we look at it here, Hodari said, well, where is the largeness in you? Yeah, you claim that you are a large tree. I can't see that. You know, you, alu, is not even visible. It's not even visible. And here is where the content of the proposition and the form of the language kind of, you know, work together to tell us something about this utterance here, that this is really quite meaningful. So this is not just lu, but a lu is not visible. Right? And then the tree responds with, oh yeah, tadi Pak ketemu tukang kayu Pak, dia punya perkakas. Again, you know, address terms. And as we know from the work of Jean Lerner, published in 2003, he said that if the address term, the position of address term actually is informationally meaningful. And when the address term is at the end, usually it tells you something about the stance of the speaker. So in this case, it's kind of a stance toward what is said and toward the interlocutor. So we know, again, that the woodworker is a male person, right? Because remember tukang kayu, the noun phrase tukang kayu, we don't know whether it's a woman or a man, but we know from this that actually it's a man. Yeah. And then Budi shakes his head with face still covered with his shirt, and everyone was laughing. And then Ari said, his co-host said, "Gua nggak berani ketawa, gua. I don't dare laugh. I don't dare laugh." And then Budi said, "Well, actually, I'm the same. I don't dare either. It's actually funny, but yeah, it's actually funny, but." So it's a trope. Yeah, it's very tropic, meaning that, you know, it's not just funny, but it's actually funny, but. So we get an indication here that the action, you know, what Kodari has said, it's actually something that is troublesome, that is blameworthy. But so far, we haven't really got any explicit blame from anyone, right? So that's the first interview. Let's now have a look as a summary of the interviewer's responses. So again, you know, Budi Ari partly covers his mouth and then smiles faintly at his co-host, doesn't say anything. Budi's nasal laugh at the beginning. He tops that up with laughing, you know, moving his body, and then again sits away from Mr. Q and then back, and then, you know, and the rest of it. And then we can see here, he first of all, he laughed, you know, ha, 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 tilts his head back, and then, you know, covers 3/4 of his face. And this is what we have just discussed. And this is what happened after he, you know, or during the time they said that. He said that with his face covered, right? And Ari, meanwhile, is still going like this, you know, I'm not sure what I want to say here. Right? Okay, so that's an indication something is going on here. Now, this is a different interview that gives us an idea. It's by different people, gives us an idea that people do recognize this, what Kodari has just animated is something that is blameworthy, yeah, as something that needs to be exonerated. This is another interview between Sylvia and Adi. So Adi Prayitno was being asked about that very animation. You know, Sylvia actually said, "Mas Kodari, recently his statement went viral. He talked about the banyan tree, because the banyan tree is the symbol of the Golkar. So it doesn't matter which tree precisely gets talked about, it's a tree, right? Because the figure tree says that he was a teak tree, not a banyan tree. But here, actually, Sylvia said, "Oh, no, he talked about the banyan tree." And Golkar is the banyan tree, that is, and it eventually fell due to the doing of the woodworker. This was in Indonesian. I just translated this for, you know, to make it easier for you. And she asked, "Do you agree, Mas Adi?" And Adi said, "Well, for me, it was a rather arrogant statement. In my view, that is, the one who can topple the banyan tree are those internal to the banyan tree itself. If it's just the internal to the party, competition for leadership, then that's okay, right? To facilitate the process of regeneration," she said, "that's not an issue. But the woodworker, if represented as an outsider, an external party," he said, "I don't think that's appropriate." And then he goes to say something like this, which is quite nice. "In my view, it's not good for democracy that in this country, people in power can do anything." So he comments on something else. It's not just about the animation, but it's about summing it up and then topping it up with a comment from him about the state of the of politics in Indonesia. Okay. Okay, so we can see here that the tree has been explicitly identified with the former leader of Golkar, but there was no mention of the former president. But this picture I found on the internet, Jokowi looking at the, so we know who the tukang kayu is, but nobody says, you know, it's Jokowi. However, this is what Jokowi himself said. He said, "Ini sehari dua hari." Anyway, let's have a look at the English. So he said, and this was in his speech at the closing of Golkar Party's convention. He said, "For the past day or two, if we look at social media, mass media, we hear a lot of noise following the decision related to the regional elections. When I opened social media, one of the things still being talked about was the woodworker, tukang kayu. If you often open social media, you will know who this woodworker is." Even though we all know that the one who made the decision was the Constitutional Court, that, you know, who is going to be the leader of the party, who is going to be appointed and who is not. And Jokowi said it's the jurisdiction of the judiciary, it's a decision of the judiciary. And what is currently being discussed in the DPR Parliament is a legislative matter. Yet people are still talking about the woodworker. But that's okay. Such are the colors of democracy. But what I want to say is that as an executive, I am the executive branch of government. As president, I really respect the judiciary, the legislative body. So and then he corrects himself, we really respect the authority and decisions made by each of those institutional values. So he actually responds to the animation, right? Now, we're going to have a look at the other two interviews very quickly. And we can see here that people keep animating. So the initial animation is repeated. Why is that? If you've already got into trouble, why do you do it? Right? So there is this really nice term from David Matza and Gershom Sykes' paper called techniques of neutralization. Basically, they talk about technique of neutralization as a mechanism by which delinquents resist the urge to follow moral obligations in order to commit illegitimate acts. So in other words, they justify the wrongdoing by saying, oh, it's okay because we blah, right? And so we can see here, we're going to have a look at two ways that neutralization is realized in the reanimation. So repeat performances of the animation. So the first one is through explicit identification of the blameworthy action. So if before that was just through covering one's face and saying something, oh, I don't dare laugh, they will be explicit in the reanimation. And then there's a role transformation, just so nice. This is what language can show you. So in the reanimation, here is, again, this is on a different date. The first interview was on the 12th of August. This is on the 25th, quite close together. Budi, and there's an additional interviewer, Shari, a woman. So Budi just gets off his seat and he walks across and he said, oh, and Shari said, why? What are you doing? And tapping the table and said, furniture, right? Furniture. And of course, everyone laughs. And there was no animation beforehand. Budi just got up before Kodari was introduced. And Shari said, what are you doing? Furniture. And so immediately that guides the construal from the previous animation, right? And Shari said, yeah, why are you doing that? Yeah, you shouldn't be doing something like that. But then it just continues. Mr. Q then picks it up and says, Lu, exactly the same. You before, what were you? Were you a teak tree? And then I became like this. Yeah, obviously I met the woodworker. So he reanimated, right? And Shari is asking here, because at this point, this is the beginning of interview. This is just so interesting because, Kodari is not just very straightforwardly being introduced. Here is, blah, but in fact, through that animation. And then Shari realizes that he hasn't been formally interviewed. Remember, this is institutional talk. You have to be interviewed. You have to be introduced. And so Shari is asking Ari, co-host, was Kodari actually the only person who coined the term tukang kayu? See, he's already identified with that term. So Shari actually uses the term mencetuskan for coining. Mencetuskan, cetus is to initiate, to come up with something. And then Ari was being asked, actually, that's not initiate. That's not cetus. That's ceplos, playing with words. Ceplos means you're saying something you should not have said. It's committing a gaffe. So it's very explicit that it was a gaffe. It wasn't just an innocent kind of animation. A gaffe is mild, but then it gets better. So then Budi, again, they just, they don't stop, these guys. Budi just said, so when he sees, referring to Kodari, so when he sees furniture, when he sees wood, he'll do this first, right? Shari said, mana itu? Where's that? And tapping. And then again, Kodari does it again. This is within the same interview. Lu dulu siapa? Who were you before? How strong were you, right? But then this time he said, it's not just that he says, how strong were you, like animating. He said, you ask. So he's teaching the other saying, okay, lu dulu siapa? Who were you before? How strong were you? You ask. That's what you should be asking when you do the animation. So there's a role reversion here where the co-participant is being taught how to animate. So I'm arguing that this is actually a technique of neutralization. This is what you do. He goes on. And then Budi picks up. Who were you before? And he copies. Okay, so that's what I should do. What I should say. Lu dulu siapa? Who were you before? And Mr. Q said, that's right. That's what you do, right? And Ari said, bring in. Now he picks up the rest of this. This is a really beautiful joint construction. Bring in, and then Gatty, fig tree, and Syari, who's again wasn't in the, he said, yeah, stop it already. And everyone just laughs. And then Ari said, okay, enough already. Let's drop it here, right? But Budi just keeps going. And he said, sandalwood at the tree. And Ari said, I'm scared, actually, right? I'm scared. So we know that it's a blameworthy action. But then Kodari exonerates by saying, udah, right? Literally, it means already. What is already? It's already cooled down, he said. And Syari said, oh, udah sejuk ya. Oh, it's already cooled down? Yes, it's already cooled down. And then Syari said, not shown here. Oh, that's all right then. So he's fixed it. He's fixed the relations with the president. He's close to the president, former president, right? So he said, that's okay, I've sorted it out. So now we can actually do it again, right? And that's exactly what they did. And again, this is a day later. There's another interview just with Kodari himself. Ari introduces Kodari this time, and he said, okay, and today we already have with us, institutional talk, political commentator who has been cursed, dihujat. So we know that that's how people have treated the animation. And then Budi said, cursed not only because of his comments, but because of his laughter, because he has this very shrill laughter. So again, these comments are very important. And then Kodari responds by saying, nah, and Budi, nah. And Kodari said, hey, don't forget the... So, and then at that sign, this is a sign, Budi then says, what did it used to be? Dulunya apa? So that invites the reanimation. And then Mr. Q said, so actually, you should say, he said, so actually, this table, what was it before? So he really brings the imagined world to the here and now. This table, what is it before, right? Has it been found? So he's talking about the resignation of the Golkar leader, of course. Do we know the reason? And Budi said, not yet. Okay, I'll go very quickly here. So Kodari, again, swings his arm left and points forward, and then actually he lowers it. And he said, oh, those people who are who scorn me. So he knows that his action has been identified as blameworthy. Now he exonerates himself very explicitly. He said, it's Kodari, actually, referring to himself in the third person, is the one who has said that. And then he brings it back to I, as in he, the Kodari. I actually talked about a woodworker and a tree, about what a tree is, what a woodworker is. That's your imagination, really. Everyone's got their own fantasy. That you tell me that that's about about President Jokowi and about Erlangga Hartarto. I only talked about woodworker and the tree. So that's how he exonerates himself, right? So very explicit. So then we can see here that the term the woodworker has been picked up as a label for Jokowi, and including picked up by Jokowi himself. Right? So here is a nice quote by Asif Aga, the anthropologist. He said, the so-called use of a form is never just the use of a single sign. The idiom typically describes a text pattern, meaning, language in use, in which many other signs make a contribution. And these contributions may partly cancel the categorical effects of the form. Tukang kayu is just a woodworker, someone who works with wood, but because of the co-occurring signs in the animation, then you get this idea that is actually about politics, right? So again, this is one of the ways in which a label could go around, yeah? And it's still going around, repeated by none other than Kodari himself and the guys at Total Politik. Okay, just to close now. So we can see here that blameworthy action and its exoneration can be usefully examined across multiple events. We just need to know, how are these events linked and what links them? How do we explain what links them? So we know that the interviewers recognized the implications of Mr. Q's animation. And maybe because of that they join in the reanimation. So it's a technique, joining the reanimation is a technique of neutralization. And I would also argue that it's a semiotic bridge that links the reanimation to the initial animation. So here we can see that the animating and reanimating, it's a comment on political conduct. It's not just for something funny, right? We know this. And we get this if we look at the language and we look at the multiple interviews. And so what we have seen here tells us something about the relationship between the here and now, the moment by moment interaction, and something that is larger in the macro political context in Indonesia. So what's Indonesian about this? There's something that's really interesting because, remember Aris says, oh, I'm scared, right? Let's stop this, I'm scared. So it's not just Kodari himself that's implicated. So the other participants actually feel implicated. There might be repercussions of what you do, and then Kodari exonerates himself, right? Oh, are those guys actually? I'm only saying about, free and a woodworker, what's wrong with that, right? So we can see that institutional talk is not just about the journalist here or the content creator here and about the interviewees here, as studies of institutional talk, of the news interviews have so far seemed to be putting an emphasis on. But I would say that it's actually, in cases like this, it's all participants feel implicated. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.